Each winter, adult gray seals come to shore on Seal Island, which is a national wildlife refuge off the coast of Maine. In the midst of falling snow and freezing temperatures, the seals give birth, nurse their pups, and mate. While island life isn't necessarily easy at this time of the year, after all, it is winter on the Maine coast, gray seals find success in an unforgiving and changing environment. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this live chat brought to you by Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. My name is Mike Fitz. I'm the resident naturalist with Explore.org, and we're in the midst of gray seal season on Explore. To help us learn more about gray seals, I'm joined by two guests. Dr. Stephanie Wood is a marine biologist and a professor of seal biology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Stephanie studies gray and harbor seals off the coast of the Northeast U.S. and is an expert in their population dynamics. My other guest today is Caitin Fitzmaurice, a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Caitlin, her master's of science research uses photography and webcams to study seal populations, and I'm glad they were taking the time out of their day to teach me and everyone at home a little bit more about these, what can be somewhat reclusive animals, because we don't get the opportunity to see them in person all that often. So Stephanie, Caitlin, thanks so much for joining me today.
Sure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
And if you have questions about gray seals for Stephanie and Caitlin, don't be shy. Drop those in the comments in the chat below the live camera feed. Brian from Explore.org will be there, and he'll be searching for those questions and sending them in my direction. We'll try to answer a few of those questions either during the chat or after I get through the questions that I have for our guests. And I do have a ton of questions for you, of course, about these animals. I think maybe to begin, we can start with some basic questions about what seals are doing at this time of the year, specifically gray seals on Seal Island. Our camera on Explore.org focuses on gray seals. It's located on Seal Island in Maine, which is located more than 20 miles southeast of Rockland, Maine. So it's kind of out there. It's not really close to the mainland at all. And there are a lot of islands, hundreds in fact, off the coast of Maine, and many, many more if you include the nearby maritime provinces of Canada. So if you're a gray seal, why would you choose an island like Seal Island? What are they doing there right now?
Sure. So that's a great question. And certainly, one thing that we always try to figure out, why are they choosing where they go? So right now we are in the middle of the gray seal pupping season. So in the Northwest Atlantic, they pup from early December through basically early February. In different parts of the world, the pupping season is actually in different seasons. So if you head over to Scotland, they actually have their pups in October and November. And if you head to the Baltic Sea, they have their pups in March. So there's a little bit of a shifting time frame depending on which part of the world you're in. And so we know that the gray seals in particular, so they like to be on really offshore islands when they're having their pups. They tend to choose islands that don't have, a ton of sort of forest on them. Seals in general don't use a lot of islands that have a lot of forest on them. And we think that's related probably to land predators, that they didn't want to be sort of exposed to land predators, especially when they're having their pups. And so generally, that's how we think about which islands they're on. However, as you said, there's a lot of islands that look really identical to us, and they definitely prefer some of them, and we don't fully understand exactly why they sometimes choose some islands versus others.
And that's I think something that's a little bit of a mystery about these animals. And you mentioned something about land predators. There was a question that came up in a viewer comment many days ago that somebody was actually wondering whether seals in this location are exposed to land-based predators. And it seems like they're not. They're just so far offshore that they really don't have to worry too much about that. Is that the correct assumption?
Right. Yeah. On Seal Island, there are no land predators. But, if you go to, say, parts of, the Outer Cape in Massachusetts, certainly we see things like coyotes preying on pups in particular, usually.
Oh, very interesting. Okay. So, and the gray seal pups are growing rapidly. during the first few weeks of their lives. I read they gain about 3 pounds of body mass per day on a diet of mother's milk. And their milk, in fact, is like super fatty. It's some of the fattiest of all milk in mammals. It has a fat content something like 60% by volume. And incredibly, I also found this fascinating that mother gray seals fast while they're nursing their young. So how is the mother gray seal able to, accommodate her pup's nutritional needs as well as her own at this time of the year if she's not eating?
Sure. Caitlin, you want to take that one? I don't want to.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, those gray seal pups will nurse for a few weeks, and as you said, the mom is fasting that whole time. So she relies on the energy she'd stored in her fat in that blubber layer. So she'll use that to keep herself and her pup fed during that time.
Yep.
And it's
so they're what we call.
So please.
I was just going to say they're what we call capital breeders. So there's sort of, when we look at animals, they can be either what we call capital breeders or income breeders. And so capital breeders basically spend a lot of the year really eating, and like Caitlin said, really getting as thick of a layer of blubber as they can. So a lot of the large whales do this as well. And then when they're in that breeding season, they rely on that both to sustain themselves and then their calf or pup, which is sort of different than other animals that sort of eat year round. So, other marine mammals, things like bottlenose dolphins or sea lions or things that tend to be sort of more temperate and tropical, and aren't sort of as impacted by seasonal changes. They tend to be more what we call income breeders. They just feed all the time. But these guys are historically, from an evolutionary standpoint, are ice seals, and so they're from that sort of very unpredictable habitat, and so they have this different type of life history strategy.
And the pups also experience a pretty abrupt transition when they're weaned. It doesn't seem like they are exposed to any sort of like mixing period between mother's milk and wild food or other foods. They're weaned, and then mother sort of abandons them. They stay on the island for a little bit of time as they're sort of like their body matures. So how are they dealing with that? How are they transitioning without sort of like that mixing period? And is that typical of what you would find in like seals and sea lions and other pinnipeds?
It's typical in what we call the true seals. So those are things like harbor seals and gray seals and hooded seals and harp seals. And so the pups as well, that's the goal for the mom, is to really get their pup as fat as they can be as well. So then the pups actually live off their fat for a while too before they sort of get hungry enough and head into the ocean. But you're right, no one teaches them how to find food. They have to do that all on their own. And so really there's varying sort of amounts of time that they're on the island. It's probably about a week, we think, depending on the animal. And then they head out to sea. And, one of the things that we see in gray seals is first-year mortality, or a lot of seals, this first-year mortality is really high. And part of it is that, they're basically about a month old when they head out into the ocean to find food on their own. And so it's not an easy time for them. So usually if they can kind of make it through those first couple of years of life, they end up living decades. But it's a tough go early on.
And we definitely have that opportunity to see these young seal pups entering the water for the first time. That's not happening right now, though. If you maybe a follow-up question to this, what time of the year on the seal cam on Seal Island might we see the pups entering the water for the first time?
Oh, I mean, a third week of January into February, right? Because there's pups that were born pretty soon. Yeah. So they're weaned at about 21 days. So really within about 4 weeks, they start heading into the water. What we often see, and I know I was just looking at some of the highlights, is as sort of, the moms, abruptly wean the pups, they come into estrus, they mate, and they leave the island. And so we sort of see shifts over time where, more and more females are leaving. We see shifts in sex ratio where all of a sudden there's more males than females, and eventually the adults are all gone. But you'll see these groups, we call them weaners, the pups that have been weaned, and you'll see them, they actually kind of all will hang out in these cute little groups and sort of hang out together till they head out to sea. But you can definitely see that even on the Seal Island cam. Again, probably not for another, couple of weeks, but for sure we often see that. And it's definitely in the highlights because I was just watching it.
All right. Well, that'll be something to look forward to is weener season on Explore.org. So
yes,
I don't think I'll say
exactly.
that. Yeah.
Things you never thought you'd say.
Right. And it's kind of interesting too to think about how well adapted they are to cold water. And I always when I learn about how animals are adapted to their environment, I often compare them to my own body and humans just in general. And we're a species that's adapted for tropical climates. Even though we've spread across the planet, we trap a tropical climate basically against our skin by using our clothing or heating our buildings, for example. So in contrast, gray seals they're quite comfortable in air and water temperatures that would kill an unclothed person. And I've read that weaned gray seal pups have a zone of a wide zone of tolerance or thermoneutrality in air. And that maybe to back up a little bit, thermoneutrality is basically just like the zone of balance for an organism in its environment in which the animal doesn't have to expend energy to keep warm or cold. And for a gray seal pup in air, I read that's somewhere between 19 degrees Fahrenheit and 73 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm a little bit more interested on the cold end of that scale. How are gray seals and their pups able to tolerate such chilly weather and water so well?
You want me to take this, Caitlin, or you want to?
Sure. So if we go back to the layer of blubber that provides all of that energy, it also keeps them really warm in the winters. And they have a waterproof fur coat as well. So those combined help regulate that temperature.
Yep.
And we do have, questions that I have, of course, lined up about the research that the both of you have been doing on seals over the last, several years. So now that we've established a little bit about their natural history and what they're doing on Seal Island, I kind of want to talk about that. Gray seals are marine mammals. We don't get to see them very often out of the water. It's very difficult to track them in water. So maybe, Caitlin, if you could talk more about how challenging it can be to study a marine mammal and one that only comes to shore for brief periods of time of the year. So what challenges are you facing when you're trying to study these animals?
Yeah, so exactly what you said, where they're sharing their time at sea and at land, it's hard to kind of calculate when we'll be able to see them. So for our work in the Boston Harbor Islands, we'll target the low tide because we know that's when, the low tide, we know that's when we'll see them hauled out or on land. And then on Seal Island, we can see them during that breeding season, again, because that's when they're on land. So yeah, just kind of keeping an eye on their behavior patterns and watching that to find them.
And you're focusing kind of specifically on haul out sites and at this time of the year, rookeries like Seal Island to estimate population size. So how are you doing that? Maybe more specifically, how are you going to a haul out or a rookery to estimate a population of a species that's widespread in the North Atlantic?
Yeah, so for seals, what we often use are aerial surveys, actually. So we'll go out and fly over, a bunch of different. There we go. We will go out and fly over various sites of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, along with some of our other partners at places like AMC's, fly surveys, photographs the seals, and then what we do, there we go, yep, so people get a little dizzy sometimes zooming around. And so we go up, we photograph the islands, and then we use various software to stitch the images together and then actually get a count. And that, gives us basically sort of a minimum number. And then sometimes from that, depending on how many times in a season we can fly and other information we can collect, we can get at some sort of, estimate. Or often what we're doing is sort of estimating trends in the population as well. There's sort of a lot of layers in estimating population. So with gray seals in particular, even thinking about the pupping season, pups that were born on, say, December 15th are gone from Seal Island by January 15th. So depending on when you fly, if you only fly on, say January 20th, right, you've missed some of those animals. And so there's various ways we try to collect as much information as possible to piece that together. And then the other important piece to remember is that this is actually a Northwest Atlantic population. And so we know from genetic study and satellite tags and seeing animals with brands, which we either see in person on the islands or we sometimes even get to see using things like the camera system on Seal Island. We can find an animal, we send it up to our partners at Canada's DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and we say, hey, we see this, animal here that has this brand, and who is it? And they'll say, oh, that was an animal, a gray seal that was born in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in 2016 was one that we saw last year, and various things. So it's really trying to piece together the whole population dynamics is really challenging, but there's lots of different pieces that go into it. And then Caitlin can talk a little bit more specifically as well, and that population dynamics is really the big picture, right? What's happening with these 400 plus thousand gray seals that live from the Gulf of St. Lawrence all the way down to Nantucket Sound, and certainly even outside of Pupping go further south, versus what are individuals doing. And that's what Caitlin's really working on, is using the camera systems to also, well, she can explain more of it, but also think about things like individual habitat choice and stuff. So I'll turn that back over to her.
Sure. So yeah, we're using photos both in the Boston Harbor Islands and on Seal Island through the webcam to take photos of those individuals and later match them up to see exactly where they're going and what they're doing. And, with a long-term study, you can see where they're going over time throughout their life and track those changes as well.
Yeah. Gray seals tend to be what we say. Oh, sorry. Gray seals are what we call phyllopics. So generally, individuals tend to return to where they were born when it's time for them to have their own pups. And so Caitlin's work will, start to chip away at some of that type of stuff as well, sort of individual habitat use, which is really interesting to think about, especially in a population that's recovering and recolonizing various parts of its former range.
And especially, I was thinking as you were both speaking about how difficult it can be to identify these seals individually. You were mentioning maybe if they have like a certain marking or something, you can look at that. But Caitlin, when you're looking at like photos, from a camera or from a webcam, how are you differentiating between individuals? Over some of these like repeat survey sessions or years. I imagine that a first year seal grows very, very large over the course of time. So they're going to look very different, and even the adults too. When you're looking at the webcam, it looks like a lot of the mother seals and the adult males are fairly identical in appearance. So I'm curious to know how you are trying to tell them apart and what techniques you're using in that way.
Yeah, so seals can be really tricky. I've been spoiled. I worked with humpback whales in the past where if they lift their tail up out of the water, you get a picture and you have a pretty good chance of matching them up later. But with seals, you have to, not only time it right for when you can get enough good photos at enough good angles with the lighting and with just how they're positioned. If they show you one side of them, both sides, all of that comes into play. But with harbor seals, their spot patterns tend to stay pretty consistent over time. Whereas with our gray seals, they do change over time, not so much year to year, but over longer periods of time. So if you were missing some data in between, it might be harder to identify individuals. Males, their spots will turn darker and spread further a lot quicker. So when they're adults, they tend to be a darker gray or brown color with hardly any spots, whereas females will keep their spots for a lot longer, but still go through that transitioning of them, spreading larger and darker over time. So yeah, it really just comes down to getting enough good photos at enough good angles to be able to match them up.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. And Caitlin's doing the bulk of that work now, and so that's part of what we're interested in. So there are seal photo ID efforts in various parts of the Northeast U.S. We have colleagues who've been on the Isle of Shoals for years, and certainly people around the Caitin Islands in various places. And our hope, sort of our big dream, there's a Northwest Atlantic Seal Research Consortium that a lot of our research partners belong to, and we'd love to create sort of a huge database at some point, because we know these animals are moving, but it's a lot of work to build that up, which is what Caitlin's doing right now. And she referenced the other part of her project is going out in Boston Harbor Islands, and for that we're not using remote cams, we're actually going out and photographing. And so what will be really interesting is sort of comparing that work where, there's a lot of field effort where you're out on the boat and you're out in the water and you need funding to do that versus using a remote system. And so one of the questions we have is, how are these two different approaches to get at the same information at seal photo ID, and how will these two different approaches work, which will be really interesting to see, because it's field work in the winter can be really challenging. And so getting out there, you could, it'd be really difficult to try and go to Seal Island every day in January or something like that. You'd sort of be setting yourself up for failure. And so comparing, which approach works best depending on where you're working is really part of what Caitlin's also trying to figure out.
And what has that work revealed so far? If you could share just a little bit about maybe the movements or the population, dynamics of gray seals in the Atlantic, or in this part of the Atlantic.
Yeah. So a lot of the photos, again, are still in that matching stage. So we haven't revealed a ton yet, but just looking back through photos, there are at least a handful, probably more, of individuals that we've definitely seen before and are seeing again over time. And then another great example from last winter was the branded seal, as Stephanie mentioned earlier. We were able to get a photo of a branded seal on Seal Island and kind of figure out where it had been seen before.
And I know that a lot of people are, a lot of people are very interested in how you're doing this research. So if you're a webcam viewer, is there a way that a webcam viewer could support, this effort?
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. Like Caitlin said, it's very, we're sort of following some of the protocols that others have used. And like Caitlin mentioned, sort of, getting both sort of the left and the right side of the head and shoulder area, or maybe there's some unique pattern somewhere. So it's sort of just, systemically moving through the colony. But certainly I think that if there were, citizen scientists interested, I know there's camera operators and they've always been really supportive, certainly we could think about involving more people. Caitlin spends time, dedicated time collecting images for her, but obviously she can't do that all day, every day. So certainly crowdsourcing, it would be really great.
And I know we have some viewer questions coming in. We'll try to get to a few of those in just a few moments. But the last section of questions that I have for the both of you really kind of have to do with seal conservation, the recovery of gray seals in this part of the Atlantic Ocean. They're seen regularly now in many parts of the Northeast U.S., but that wasn't really the case, especially like even up into the mid, even the latter parts of the 20th century. Gray seals in particular were largely extinct from much of the U.S. waters for a long period of time. So what led to their disappearance? And then I think we'll have some follow-up questions, of course, about how they've recovered.
Sure. Yeah. So, and I think this is a really important thing to remember, and we're seeing this in a lot of different systems as, conservation efforts are successful. We then have sort of different scenarios where there are animals in places that people don't have a living memory of, right? And so certainly along the Northeast U.S. coast, we see seals, in many places where we didn't. So we know from archaeological sites, so from shell middens, Native American shell middens, which are areas which were basically sort of the discarded stuff. So we see fish bones and seal bones and just different things that are sometimes sort of referred to as sort of the discarded area of an encampment. We can go through that and find different species which were being consumed by people, and so we can go back and say, okay, we know that harbor and gray seals were found, throughout the Northeast U.S. because we can see them in all these middens from, all along the coastline. What happened really was more in colonial times was that seals were perceived as a threat, mostly as a competitor for fisheries resources. And so just in the same way that, coyotes and bobcats and, a lot of land predators, wolves, all those things were seen as a threat to us, there were bounty systems. And so people were paid anywhere from $1 to $5 for every seal that they killed. And they would turn in either a nose or a tail and get paid that. There were, tons of sort of local bounties in various towns in Maine and Massachusetts, and then both states actually had statewide bounties for various time periods. In the 18 and 1900s, actually, Massachusetts had a gray seal bounty on its records until the early 1960s. So these bounties existed for a long time. It's a little tricky in other parts of the world. Bounties can be used to sort of backcast population size. There was a fair amount of cheating in the bounties in the Northeast U.S., so the numbers are a little bit unreliable, but estimates are that it's tens of thousands of seals that were killed under these bounties. And so basically gray seals in particular were extirpated. They went locally extinct, and so it was really rare by the mid 1900s to see them there. And this is true even into Canadian waters. The estimate for the entire Northwest Atlantic is that there were about 2,000 gray seals left on Sable Island, and that was it in the early 1960s. There are now over 60,000 pups born on Sable Island now every year. So they have recovered, which is great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. And what about, so how did they recover? In particular, how did changing public attitude sort of weigh into this process? I can think of legislation like the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So what ended up changing that allowed these seals to regain some of their former population size?
Mm-hmm. Caitlin, you want to talk about the act at all?
Sure. So yeah, the Marine Mammal Protection Act came into play, and it was the first kind of establishment of rules against things like the bounty on seals and just protections in general. So making sure people keep their distance from them and, reduce the disturbances as much as possible.
Yep. Yeah, so that, by the early 1970s, a lot of marine mammal populations were in a similar scenario. All the large whales populations had been, really reduced to very low numbers, and some of them, sadly, things like the North Atlantic right whale still have not recovered. So we see varying degrees of recovery, and certainly the act that protected them from hunting and harassment and things like that was really important. With seals, with gray seals in particular, the other thing we see specific to the Northeast U.S. is that a lot of the islands that they use for pupping in particular are actually also protected. So Seal Island, for example, is owned and managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's wild land, and so it's a protected space. And we see that I believe 5 of the 9 pupping sites actually are U.S. Fish and Wildlife refuges. And so the other important piece, because as you said, they do come back to land for these vital parts of their life cycle, is having habitat that's available to them. So it's a little different than what we often hear about with a lot of other sort of, terrestrial animals that, really for many species, habitat loss is a very huge and worrisome threat. But for these seals, a lot of habitat has opened up, which is somewhat related also in sort of how humans have changed. We've changed how we use coastal islands, right? So if you go back to, say, the Maine coast 100 years ago, 150 years ago, there were things like fish camps set up on a lot of those islands because we didn't have boats that could go far out fishing and with refrigeration and get all the way back to the mainland. And, people lived on islands a lot more than they do now. And so we see a shift in sort of human activity on island, which has actually had the benefit of opening habitat for the seals. So.
And their numbers, their growth in their numbers certainly hasn't happened in isolation. You have a growing population of certain animals. Oftentimes there's other animals that like to eat them, and that can grow their populations as well. So how has the growing number of seals influenced, predator numbers, specifically maybe like the sightings of sharks off of the coast?
Right. So that's always the $1 million question, right? And I usually would say right now, talk to my friend Greg Scommel, who's the white shark around here. But yes, obviously those things are related, but I think it's important to remember that just as gray seals have been protected, white sharks have actually been protected since the 1990s as well. And so, of course, yes, white sharks eat seals, but they eat a lot of other things too. And so I always want to be careful that it's not sort of like A plus B equals C. There's lots of different factors that were happening here. Certainly, they're an important prey for white sharks, but white sharks also spend a lot of the year in areas where there aren't seals. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I would also say part of the return of both of these predators, right, is a really good sign from a conservation standpoint, because now the systems are there that they're returning to, which is a really good sign, right? So different fish species have maybe recovered. You think about just all the different efforts to sort of do ecosystem restoration that a lot of species, obviously we see these big predators and that's what we focus on, but other species have benefited as well. So yes, for sure they are related, but I always want to be careful to say, it's also, it's always more complicated than that, right? If you look at a food web in the Northwest Atlantic, there's thousands of species interacting with each other. Yeah.
And I have one more question for the both of you, but we do have many viewer questions that have come in. So I want to try to answer or get an answer for a few of those before I get to my final question for the both of you. At the beginning of the broadcast, we were talking about some of the natural history and biology of seals. And one of the questions that I didn't ask you, this is sort of a basic one. I know that probably a lot of people are wondering is do they have more than one pup, or is one pup it per mother?
One pup is it. Yeah.
So
twins have been seen very rarely, and what usually would happen is they won't survive, right? So we talked about that mom really being so energetically drained, having to have enough blubber, having enough blubber to just successfully wean one pup is a lot. And so it just, for the most part, one pup.
And earlier also we talked about how sort of like the nursing period and the weaning period is overall pretty short. So could you reiterate once again about what week the mother attempts to wean her pup? That was a question that somebody was wondering as well.
Yeah, it's about 3 weeks. So very fast, although the fastest. Yeah, so hooded seals, which are found, north of here, up off on ice off of Canada, their average weaning period is 3 days. It's the shortest lactation. Yeah, so they live on ice that is very unpredictable, and so again, you want to get as much energy to that pup because there's a good chance that the ice is going to shift and you might get separated, and so it's a strategy to live in those extreme environments. Yeah.
And a follow up to that, just how big are the baby seals when they're weaned? Can you give us an estimate? Maybe to back up just a little bit, and I should ask, how big are they when they're born? And then how big are they by the time they're weaned on average?
So they're maybe like 20 kilos when they're maybe 15, 20 kilos when they're born, maybe less. I feel like I've never weighed newborns because we don't really handle them, but so they're pretty small. And then, weaning, they'll be 50 or 60 kilos. So they grow pretty fast.
And another question about pups is about a situation that we saw on the webcams yesterday. There was a newborn seal pup lying, close to its mother, and somebody was wondering, is there anything besides, maybe like a bull seal, an adult male passing over it that could harm like a newborn seal on the pupping grounds? We talked about how removed, from the mainland some of these rookeries are, but is there anything potentially on these islands that could harm the seals besides maybe just another seal being a little bit careless in its movements?
So, I mean, there's always the risk of disease as well. So we see things like, morbillivirus and various influenza strains in seal populations. And so just like what, all the things we've heard about social distancing and things with COVID, right? So depending on how sort of dense the pupping sites are, we can see disease might also impact them. Yeah.
And Caitlin, I want to throw this question to you. Is in your research, or in your studies leading up to your research, what are the trends in the overall populations of the seals? Somebody was wondering, is their population trend steady, or is it diminishing, and can we consider their populations healthy at this time?
Yeah. I mean, in my study in particular, I don't have a lot to back that up right now, but as Stephanie mentioned earlier, they are recovering. And, the numbers are a lot higher than they were over the past decade. So they seem to be doing pretty well.
And what about a baby seal's like normal body temperature? Somebody was wondering about that and what that would normally be, and does their blubber and waterproofing keep their organs at a proper temperature regardless of icy waters? So I guess that maybe is a little bit of a follow-up question to something I asked earlier about just how well adapted they are to cold water conditions overall. I've often wondered if they even feel the cold water because of their fur and their blubber, but maybe you can enlighten us just a little bit more on that adaptation that they have.
Sure. Caitlin, you want to take that one?
I mean, I'm not sure what the normal temperature is for them, but
I'm not either. Actually, I don't know what that is either. But
yeah, the
I would
blubber
imagine
and
somewhat similar to us. But yeah.
yeah. But yeah, the blubber and that waterproof coat does keep them warm, and it does keep the organs, functioning even in the cold.
And a question about predation. We did mention just a little bit about sharks, and we know that sharks will prey on seals. So on these pupping grounds, is it feasible for sharks to learn that there could be food in those areas at this time of the year? And could they be like waiting in the waters nearby, just kind of lurking, looking for a vulnerable seal to go to the water for the first time?
So I'm not a shark expert, but I believe that, at least gray seal pupping, and if we're thinking you're thinking white sharks, the gray seal pupping in this area, and white sharks, most of the white sharks I think are not in this area at the same time of year. So I don't know that they're waiting sort of around pupping sites, but I do know that white sharks certainly will wait around areas that are, well established. Seal haul-out site. So if you think of something like the Farallon Islands off of San Francisco, or certainly areas in South Africa, I certainly think that sharks, can be found reliably around some of those sites where there are also pinnipeds.
Yeah, I would imagine that if they overlap in space and time, uh, then they would be able to learn that to do that. But if a lot of the sharks are migrating south, during the wintertime, then the chances of it happening are probably much less. But again, yeah, I would have to ask a shark expert about
Yeah,
that. Maybe that'll be a question I'll save
there you
for
go.
another time. And one more
Perfect.
question about pups before we get to one final viewer question. That somebody was wondering, if a pup is born and doesn't start nursing right away, how long will it live without mother's milk? And in fact, I think some people are asking this question because last evening there was a pup that was born. We were watching it on the cameras for a little bit of time,
Yep.
and it didn't seem like it started to nurse right away. I know that some people were concerned that it was taking too long to find the teat and start nursing. So somebody was
Yeah.
just wondering, how long can they live before they essentially starve without nursing?
I mean, again, this is just sort of my rough estimate, and I saw some of those comments as well. Newborn pups, as you can see, and as you've seen on the camera, I mean, they're really pretty skinny, so they definitely need to start feeding right away. I would imagine not long, a couple of days would be my guess, maybe. I think it would depend on where they were in that 21 days. Um, Newborns, yeah, I mean, and you would want them to sort of start bonding right away. I saw some of those comments as well. And, those are the things that are hard to see sometimes in nature, right? Because sometimes it's just, it might be a new mom who doesn't quite know what to do. Maybe there's something wrong with the pup that we can't tell just by looking at the camera. It's sometimes hard to figure out why things aren't happening the way, you want to see them happen. And yeah, so I'm not sure what was happening with that particular mom and pup, but I would think it would not be long for a newborn pup to last. Yeah.
And I think sometimes it can be difficult, but sometimes it's important to just try to be a little bit patient with the mothers, because some mother animals they got it down, like they have their experience, they've been doing it for a long time,
Right.
with multiple litters, whatever species you want to do. So they make it look so easy, and then you'll see one that maybe takes a little bit longer to figure it out. But
Right.
sometimes you'll see a lot of success, and sometimes you will see failures as
Right.
well. And I think that's part of in a way part of the beauty of the natural world is all of the variation that we end up seeing in that.
Yeah.
One final question for the both of you before I get to my absolute final question for you. But this is
Okay.
one last viewer question. What effects do you think climate change will have on gray seals' behavior, their territories, or feeding? Do you have any insights into that?
I'll let Caitlin take a stab, and then I can take a stab too.
Sure. So with a lot of other mammals and just animals in general, as climate change continues and temperature shifts, sometimes those ranges can shift. So their movement patterns could change, or they could choose, different breeding grounds or haul out sites as well.
Yep. Yeah, I think the tricky thing about climate change is it's going to play out in many different ways for different species, right? And some species are going to be more significantly adapted than others. Seals are pretty plastic, right? They can, we know that individual gray seals will pup on ice in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and then they'll be seen pupping on the sandy beaches of Sable Island. So they have some, behavioral plasticity, which just sort of flexibility that allows them to be adaptive. So I think we'll sort of, which makes me think that they'll probably fare better than other species that have sort of very tight niches or really specific requirements. I think Caitlin's point is a really good one too. So temperature obviously is going to influence them, but as you pointed out, they can sort of live in this range of temperatures fairly easily. But those shifts are also going to cause regime shifts where we're going to see entire species assemblages maybe moving, or some of them moving in different directions. And so gray seals tend to be generalists in terms of the food they eat. So again, that's sort of a win for them in this column. But I think it's a little hard to know exactly how it will impact them. Yeah. So.
And my final question for the both of you, I promise, is what do you find most fascinating about these animals? Or if you want to talk more about what you enjoy most about your research with gray seals and studying them, either one. You can. I'll throw it out to you, Stephanie, first, and then Caitlin,
Sure.
you can follow up.
Yeah. So I think the thing that I find most fascinating is that they live this, aquatic life, but then they're still tied to land for really important parts of their life history. And so I think that makes them really unique, that they sort of navigate both those worlds that are really very different in terms of making a living on them. And so I find that piece from, an evolutionary standpoint, and just their behavior and how they function now just sort of really interesting. They're often called these, sentinels of the sea and things, and they really are this window into they can be this window into what's going on in the ocean, right? That's where they spend most of their time. And yet we have this opportunity to see what's going on at certain times of the year, whether they're pupping or they're molting their fur, things like that. So I think that's why I've always found pinnipeds really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. That was one of my favorite things about them too. But I think just my work in general, I just love seeing seals whenever we go out. I get excited every time we see them, and it just never gets old. So,
Me too.
Well, there's a ton to learn about these animals, and I'm looking forward to more research coming out of your university and Caitlin's research of course, with the identification of seals and their population dynamics. So I want to thank you both for taking the time this evening to join me and help us learn more about a species that's pretty difficult to study, and we're lucky enough to have a camera to watch them at one of the most important times of the year for them. So I'd like to thank my guests once again today. Dr. Stephanie Wood is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Boston, and Caitin Fitzmaurice is a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts Boston. So thanks again for being here.
Sure. And can I just say thank you to explore.org, because this is really a really exciting project, and it's just a unique opportunity. And just also thanks to all of our partners on this project. So Marine Mammals of Maine, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, Atlantic Marine Conservation Society, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So we have lots of partners that all help to get this done, but certainly explore.org, thanks to you all for having this great system that we can put out there.
Well, you're quite welcome. We're glad to partner
Sure.
with you and our other partners like Maine Audubon as well. So
Yes.
if you want to watch the seals, of course, just go over to explore.org/seals. We're recording this. It's about 7:45 Eastern time. It's the middle of January, so it's dark there right now. But tomorrow morning, tune in. We get some solar power illuminating the panels out there. You'll be able to see a lot of seals and a lot of pups in the water, and it's a wonderful scene. If you want to see some really relaxing footage, tune in tomorrow for that, and throughout the pupping season going into February. And my name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. Thanks for joining us today, and remember, as we like to say at explore.org, never stop learning.